Hello and welcome to the latest in our series of live career webinars brought to you by the HOP platform. So HOP, I'm pointing to up there, is the Hertfordshire Opportunities Portal. It is a website that we hope every young person and every school in Hertfordshire in particular and surrounding areas are aware of, because it is a website and it has social media handles that can help you access lots of information that will inspire you and inform you about your next career choices. And these webinars that we run, which we run roughly once a week, we've been doing them for about 3 years, are there to give you an expert insight into a particular career or role. So today we are going to be focusing on careers in the ambulance service. I've got a fantastic panelist for you who's going to share his experiences and knowledge with you very shortly. Before I do, just a little bit of housekeeping though. If you are watching this live, so it's Thursday, 18th of May, 4:30, well done for coming in from school, logging onto the webinar and tuning in. I think it's really good use of your time to come in and do that. To maximise this opportunity though, what I really encourage you to do as we are having this conversation, if there's any questions that you would like to ask Ben, our panelist, or anything you want a bit more clarification on, you can do that. You can do that on the questions tab. If you open that out, you'll find that you've got a little text box. Within the text box, you can type in your question. It'll only be visible to me, so no one else is going to see it. And then I will pass that question on to Ben. So make the most of that opportunity. Just to reassure you, we can't see or hear any of you. Hopefully, you will have no problem seeing and hearing us, though. This session is being recorded, so if either you can't stay until the end of it, but you want to watch it back, it will be available on our HOP YouTube channel, probably from some point tomorrow onwards. If you like it and you've got family and friends who you think might be interested in it as well, please direct them to HOP as well. On our Virtual Encounters website, you'll find, I think there's about 70 of these that we've run over the last 3 years, covering a whole host of different topics. So within this webinar today, what I hope we'll get is we're going to find out a little bit about what are the different roles within the ambulance service, what are the sorts of skills and qualities that are needed to go into those jobs, and what's an average day in the life like for people who support the ambulance services. But first of all, most important to this webinar is the panelists that we get on, and we've got a fantastic panelist for you today. So good afternoon, Ben Wall. We're delighted to have you with us today, Ben. Could you give us a bit of an introduction first of all?
Yes, good afternoon and thanks for joining everyone. So my name is Ben and I work as a recruitment specialist for the East of England Ambulance Service. I've worked for the Trust for the past 12 years and I've done a variety of different roles. So when I first started, I was a call handler, answering 999 calls. I then moved on to become a dispatcher, which is somebody that sends ambulances. And then I worked in training, so I was training other people to do those two roles before moving into the recruitment of those roles. And now I work on the recruitment of frontline roles on ambulances. So there's a variety of different roles on an ambulance that you can do that I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today.
Fantastic. So look, Ben, what would be really interesting, you said that you started as a call handler, and I mean, first of all, just explain, what does a call handler actually do? Or what did you do when you were a call handler?
Yeah, so when I first started, which was back in 2011, basically what we would do is we sat in a control center and we had headsets similar to the ones that I've got on my head today. We had two computer screens in front of us and the headsets plugged into a telephone. And what happens is when someone dials 999, they go through to an operator. The operator is somebody that works at BT who will then check whether they need police, fire or ambulance for their emergency. And if they request an ambulance, they'd then be put through to me. I would then use one of my computer screens to find them on a map. And the other computer screen has got some scripts that I follow to make sure I ask them the correct questions. So I know exactly what's happening and I know what advice to give them. And what that then does is it enables us to establish the scale of the emergency, so we can see whether we need an ambulance to come straight out on blue lights or whether perhaps they need a callback and they need a visit from a nurse. But we're just establishing the scale of that emergency so we make sure we get the best help for that patient.
Sure. Okay. Well, I'm sure many people may have questions, or they might want to hear about some examples of some of the calls that you dealt with. I'm sure there's plenty of very serious ones that you've dealt with. I'm guessing there's probably some more light-hearted ones as well that happen. So maybe we can talk about those in a while as well. But let's take a step back before that. How did you get into the role? What was it that interested you in it in the first place? And perhaps what were your career aspirations prior to becoming a call handler?
Sure. So for me, I was very open-minded as to what kind of career I wanted to go into, and my criteria, if you like, was quite simply that I wanted to help people. That was all I was really looking to do. So I looked at various different options. I didn't actually live in the city that I ended up moving to do the job. So I very much let the job choose me, if you like. I applied for a variety of things. This is the one that came good, and I've been here all this time since. So it's worked out very much for the best.
Good. Okay. And let's just explain a little bit about what we mean by the East of England ambulance service. So, I mean, first of all, let's just set the parameters around the geography and linking it to where we are in Hertfordshire. So, how's the ambulance service divided up around the country?
Sure. So you will find there's lots of different ambulance trusts that make up the UK. The East of England Ambulance Service is focusing on 6 different counties. So I'm based in Norfolk, but we also cover Suffolk, Essex, Cambridgeshire, Bedfordshire, and yourselves in Hertfordshire.
Yeah, I've got a better graphic for that there, which hopefully is on the screen and visible for you now, which covers the areas that you're in. So, as a call handler, then in the East of England, does that mean that you are only taking calls from emergencies located in those areas, or could you be handling calls from people in the other end of the country and trying to dispatch?
That's a really good question. Interesting, the image that you've put up there, you'll see that there is 3 AOCs. The AOC stands for an Ambulance Operations Centre. So I was based in the Norwich office, but you can also see that there's one in Essex at Chelmsford and one in Bedford. So the AOCs, so those operation centres, primarily pick up calls for the county that they're in and one other surrounding county. So, for instance, the Bedfordshire control room primarily picks up the calls for Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire. The the Norwich office picks up primarily calls from Norfolk and Cambridgeshire, and the Chelmsford office picks up primarily calls from Essex and Suffolk. However, if you have an influx of calls and there's more calls than there is call handlers, let's say in Suffolk and Essex, but there's call handlers free in Norwich, those calls would then bounce across to the call handlers in Norwich to pick up. Now, on a broader scale, it is possible that we might end up picking up calls for other trusts, but generally what would happen is those trusts would let us know that they are really struggling to pick up all their calls, and we would then enable, so there's a little bit of IT involved, we'd enable their calls to be channeled through to us. So there have been times when we've picked up calls for Yorkshire Ambulance Service or even the Scottish Ambulance Service when they've had a huge amount of demand and we've had availability and they haven't to answer all their calls.
Sure. Okay. Right. Well, I won't get too tied down in the geography, but that's interesting to know. Could you gave me, Ben, in preparation, I put this in the registration form that people would have filled out here. Very good list of the different sorts of roles there are within the ambulance service. So I think in my mind, I thought there was only one job in the ambulance service, which is people who sit in the ambulance and go and attend emergencies. So could you just give us a breakdown of, I think that you detailed them as patient-facing ones and non-patient-facing roles. So if you just talk us through the patient-facing roles to start with.
Yes, I often divide it this way because I think some individuals like the idea of being face to face with patients, and I think other people would prefer to be a little bit more behind the scenes. So for the patient facing roles, here we're talking about the roles where you are working on an ambulance. And I think typically people think when they see an ambulance whiz past and they see the 2 people in green sat at the front that they're both paramedics, but that's very rarely the case. It's quite possible that one of the 2 people will be a paramedic, but it's very likely that the other person will be an emergency care assistant. So we tend to have a team of 2 different roles working together. Often it's a paramedic and their assistant. There is actually another role that sits in between the two, called a medical technician. In a nutshell, the difference between these 3 roles are that the emergency care assistant are trained in basic life support. So this would be doing things like giving CPR, doing observations on the patient, giving oxygen to a patient, and safely maneuvering the patient using the equipment on board the ambulance. They're also trained to drive the ambulance on blue lights. The next scope of practice, the emergency medical technician, they can do all of those things, but they can also administer certain medications that the emergency care assistant can't. So this person has got additional training. They can make more decisions around the care of the patient, including whether that patient needs to go to hospital or not. They could diagnose what's actually wrong with the patient. And then the next scope of practice beyond that is paramedic, which is probably the best known role on an ambulance. The paramedic has advanced life support skills, which means they can do all the things that the emergency care assistant and the emergency medical technician can do, but they can do additional things as well. For instance, they can give a lot of different types of pain relief for patients that are in a lot of pain, perhaps that need to be injected. They can also suture up wounds. So they can do a number of other things where the patient's in quite a critical condition that are more invasive procedures than what the other 2 roles can do. It is quite common for people to work their way up these 3 roles. So not everybody that works as a paramedic went to university and studied for 3 years to become a paramedic. Some of them would have worked their way up from being an emergency care assistant, then doing an apprenticeship to become an emergency medical technician, and then doing another apprenticeship to become a paramedic. So you've got 2 different pathways if you wanted to work your way up into that role.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I think that details that journey and the different choices is really nicely. So, I mean, what's the difference between someone who's a paramedic who's got the highest level of qualifications that you need here to try and treat a patient? What would be the difference between the qualifications that they would have compared to, a medical clinician working in a hospital, for instance?
Sure. So the paramedic has a paramedic science degree, and that's even if they haven't gone to the university and done it that pathway. Even if you take the apprenticeship route, you'll end up qualified in paramedic science. So that's a very specific qualification that is different to, for example, doctors that would have studied medicine specifically. So the main difference is that for a paramedic, their focus is on emergency care. So we're focused almost purely on how you manage an emergency situation, what kind of medications you give people that are in an emergency medical crisis.
Okay. And then tell us about some of the support roles. So you spoke about your role as a call handler, which is often the first port of call when someone rings through to the emergency services. But tell us about the role of a dispatcher, and tell us about the role of, I think you called it a make-ready operative.
Yes. So the dispatcher works in the control room with the call handlers. So you have a section of around about 10 call handlers working together, and they have a team leader that looks after them. And then the other side of the control room, you have a section dedicated to dispatchers, and they have team leaders as well. So the dispatcher will have 4 computer screens in front of them, and they'll also have a touchscreen digital radio in which to talk to all the ambulance crews. So what they do is they look after all the ambulances within a region. So that might be, for example, within Hertfordshire, it might be all of the ambulances that are working in and around Watford General Hospital, for instance. And what they do is they sign on those ambulances, they let the crews know when their meal breaks are, they send them to the emergency calls, they divert them to higher priority emergency calls when they're en route, they ensure that they are basically looked after. They're there to both manage and support the crews remotely. So they are in constant dialogue with the crews, letting them know what's happening. If, for instance, an ambulance needs more support, they need backup from somebody else, they would be arranging that. If the crews, for example, needed support from the fire service or police, they would be contacting the fire service and police. So it's very much a team effort between the dispatcher and the crews on the road. They also link in with the call handlers if they need any specific details that haven't come up during the questions asked by the call handler. They will ask those further questions for the call handler to gather that information.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, you said it's a team effort, and it really does sound that, both in terms of the people taking the calls and the team that actually come out to deal with the emergency. I mean, in your role as a call handler and then as a dispatcher, let's work on your own personal experiences, Ben. What were the most enjoyable parts of that role, and then equally tell us what are the challenging things about that role as well?
Sure. So let's begin with, if we begin with my first role, which was as a call handler, I would say the most challenging aspect of this role is also in some ways perhaps one of its pluses, which is that you have no idea what call you're going to get. You don't know who's on the other end of the phone. You don't know what they're experiencing in that moment. So it's very unpredictable. So there's extensive training in how to manage unpredictable behavior from your callers. You don't know if they're going to be panicked. You don't know if they're going to be angry, upset, scared. So you get extensive training to make sure that you're able to manage that situation. So it's very important that you've got a very calm, composed manner. So that's perhaps the challenge of the role. What I would say is my favorite thing about that particular role is just how rewarding it is. You will get those calls where you're just really appreciated for the help that you've given. I've delivered babies over the phone when the crew have been en route and have not been able to get there in time before the baby was born. So it's not all doom and gloom. You do have some really positive stories that come out of it as well, because not all emergency situations are actually negative situations. You can have really positive situations like that. In terms of dispatch is a very different type of role. Dispatch is really about being able to manage a huge amount of things happening at once, because you're looking after somewhere between 30 and 50 different ambulances. And one of the strange things that I certainly experienced when doing this role is that your memory becomes almost superhuman. You can picture in your mind where all these different ambulances are at any given moment. So you know wherever an emergency pops up, you just know where your closest crew is. It takes obviously quite a bit of time and practice, but it really enhances those multitasking skills in you, because you're looking after so many of them, and you just register who's doing what at all times. You're constantly talking to them. You're constantly looking at who is where, which ones have got patients on board that they're taking to hospital, which ones are actually available. There's lots of different ways that you can identify these things because they're represented in different colors. So you'll see the crews appear in different colors to represent their status. So it's very much a case of developing great multitasking skills. The challenge of the role is just the sheer volume that you're having to manage at any given time, because frequently there is more emergencies than there is crews. So you do have to use your prioritizing skills to make sure that the most life-threatening situations are addressed at all times. The most rewarding thing about this role is the team spirit that you buy into, because you really are very reliant on your crews working with you, and they're very reliant on you to keep them safe. So it's that bond that you build with your team in green, and also with the call handlers and various other roles that you come across in that particular role.
Yeah. You spoke about the progression for those patient-facing roles, and you've also spoken about the non-patient roles. Do the two ever cross? Do you get people who are dispatchers who then go in to become emergency care assistants, or does it happen the other way around?
Yes. So in my time when I was training dispatchers, there was occasions where we had people that had switched across from working as an emergency care assistant to then become dispatchers. And we also had it the other way around. We've had people that have switched across from working as dispatchers to either work as emergency care assistants or to take up the apprenticeship to become an emergency medical technician. So that's actually very common that people will pick up a role within one environment, either the road or the control room, and use that as a stepping stone to go the other way. Um, I would say it's more common that people begin in the control room and then move across to working in what we call ops or operations, which is out on ambulances. But that's by no means the case every time. There is definitely times when people switch the other way round.
Sure. You said that in your time as a call handler, you once helped someone deliver a baby. So I'm just interested, what level of medical training or knowledge do call handlers have to be put into that situation where you're giving people literally life and death information at quite a critical time? What sort of training do you get on that side of things?
Sure. So I think it's perhaps worth noting that with roles such as call handler, dispatcher, emergency care assistant, and with emergency medical technician, with all four of those roles, when you apply, you're not expected to have any prior medical knowledge. Um, Everything is taught to you. So there is obviously criteria. There's things you're expected to have, GCSEs wise, and also for the jobs on the road, you'll be expected to have your driver's license for a year. But if we go back to the call handler training that you're asking about there's a 6-week training program which I used to teach, and during this 6 weeks, we would spend time familiarizing the new call handlers with the system that they'll be using, because it's the system that guides them through what questions to ask. So for instance, if for example we've got somebody that is calling because they've got chest pains, there'll be a set of questions specifically for chest pains. If they're calling because there's been a car accident, there'll be a set of questions specifically for road traffic collisions. There's 36 different protocols that they can go down. So it's just identifying in each situation which protocol do they go down. Is it chest pains, abdominal pains, road traffic collisions, and so on. And that then guides them through the correct questions. And based on how they answer those questions, that gives the caller code which establishes how life-threatening that situation is. And at the end of the call, we'll then give them advice as to what to do next.
Okay. There's a couple of really good. Sorry, no, go on.
I was just going to say the one other thing perhaps to mention about the training is that a huge percentage of that time is just practicing scenarios. So it's not just about knowing which protocol to go down, it's about how do you manage different types of caller. How do you manage when you can barely hear your caller because the line's so bad? How do you manage when your caller is shouting at you? How do you manage when your caller when they're very, very afraid? It's about managing that. It's that personal interaction with your caller, and being able to manage your own emotions on a call, because you don't want to get caught up in it. You've got to keep empathetic, but that distance to make sure that you can manage the situation well. And it's about building those skills. You're not expected to know how to deal with situations you haven't faced before, because it's quite a unique experience to manage an emergency. People don't do that many times in their life, and yet we're expecting you to do it multiple times a day. So it's ensuring that you feel equipped to deal with that, and you really grow as a person just through being able to manage these types of situations.
Absolutely. There's a couple of questions that are already coming in. I'm going to come on to those very shortly because they link quite nicely into our next range of topics. But the other question I was going to ask you, Ben, is what are the shift patterns like, both for call handlers and dispatchers, and as well as the teams, the operations team actually in the ambulances?
Sure. So they tend to be either 10 or 12-hour shifts. For these roles, when you first start, you are on what's called a relief rota. which means that you'll know what your shifts are between 6 and 9 weeks ahead. And some weeks they may well be 10-hour shifts, some weeks they may be 12s, but overall it will balance out so that you're not working any more than anybody else that works a full-time job.
Okay, great. And do you tend to work in unison with the same operation teams in the ambulances? Because I mean, I'm sure it's around building relationships. So will you find that you're on duty at the same time as them, or does that not really pan out like that?
So the rotas are different. So on my rota when I was a call handler, I used to work a pattern of Monday to Thursday nights for my first week, then Monday to Thursday days, and then Friday to Sunday nights, Friday to Sunday days, and then I'd have 3 random shifts on my 5th week, and that was my pattern. There's not necessarily going to be a matching pattern for the crews on the road. It just depends on what their schedulers need in terms of cover. So there's not necessarily that exact link up. But in some ways, that's not a bad thing because it means you get to know everybody rather than only very occasionally coming across the odd person that, you know, on the road. You build a bond with everybody.
Sure. Okay, fine. Well, look, let's move into them. This is what people seem to be asking questions about, and that's how do you actually get into the ambulance service? And you've mentioned a couple of things around apprenticeship positions as well. So first of all, what's the age limit? At what point can someone apply to join the ambulance service, Ben?
Yeah, so given the nature of the work and that we're dealing with emergency situations, the roles typically begin at the age of 18. Within the control room environment, the call handler position requires four GCSEs, including maths and English, at 4 or above. There is one alternate route through, which is if you've got significant customer service experience within a control room, sorry, not a control room, a call center environment, that's considered an equivalent because that's where you're going to be working. So that's how you would meet the criteria for the call handler position. For the dispatcher position, you would need to have 5 GCSEs at a 4 or above, including maths and English. Then for your roles on the road, so the emergency care assistant role, you would need to have maths and English at a grade 4, and you'd also need to have a driver's license with no more than 3 points on your license, and you'd need to have had that for a year, so we know you're a good driver. Lastly then, the apprentice emergency medical technician. For that particular job role, you would need to have had your driving license for a year with no more than 3 points on your driver's license, and you'd need to have maths and English as grade 4.
Sure. Okay, so look, very, very well detailed and laid out there, Ben, the different entry routes in. Are there any particular subjects, you know, whether that's at GCSE level or at level 3, that perhaps aren't prerequisites, but you would maybe recommend someone study?
So yes, I mean, I think it's always an advantage to build up as much of an understanding of biology, anatomy, physiology, those types of things about the human body, because a lot of that is what you cover when you do your emergency care assistant training and your apprentice emergency medical technician training. So actually, thinking back to it, studying GCSE PE or A-level PE is actually really helpful because you're learning all about the human body and how it works. Same goes for biology. So they're actually really useful subjects to do in terms of background knowledge for these types of roles. English and maths are deemed very important for these roles. So any further progression that you do past GCSE, so if you were doing A-level English or A-level maths, that can only help.
Okay, and then I always like to ask this question, and I'm putting you on the spot here, Ben. What are the sorts of functional English and maths skills at GCSE level that are actually required or needed in these sorts of roles that make getting those grades really important?
Sure, I think that's a really good question because it might seem like it's just a tick box exercise where you just have to have these things because everyone always wants maths and English. But if I just briefly explain why in this role, when you're working on an ambulance, in any of these roles really, it's so important. But also when you think about your work as a call handler or dispatcher, having clear communication skills where you can explain to people explicitly what's happening, whether you're a dispatcher explaining why another crew needs backup for such and such a condition and what they actually require from the person that's running as backup, or whether you're a call handler and your caller has got perhaps English isn't their first language. It's critical that English is your first language in order for them to understand you as clearly as possible. Or if it isn't your first language, that you have a really good understanding of English and you can communicate well. And then on the road, obviously, when you're out there and you're meeting patients, you're trying to find out what's happened to them. You've got to build up a good rapport with them and have good communication skills so they understand what it is that you're asking them. So that's why English is so important. For maths, the reason why this specifically is important, I would say, for the crews on the road is because you're measuring up drugs, you're combining different medications, and it's crucial that you get the measurements correct and you add in the correct amounts of various different drugs. So that's why it's particularly crucial in those roles. In dispatch, for instance, why maths is important is because you're constantly keeping a log of how many resources you've got available. So you're having to do quite quick maths, working out, okay, I've got 17 emergencies ongoing. I've got 20 crews currently signed on, and just constantly working out how many have I got left? Where are they? And you record in every job that you can't cover how many resources you have, where they are, what they're doing, just to keep a record of everything that's happening at any given time. So you do need to do quite quick maths as a dispatcher as well.
Sure. Okay. No, that makes sense. And then tell us a little bit about the apprenticeship, because there's a question that's come in, so it's specifically around the apprenticeship you spoke about. How long would it take to get from starting as an apprentice as an emergency medical technician to becoming a qualified paramedic?
Sure. So the apprentice emergency medical technician course lasts, so it's 12 weeks of training, but then it takes 18 months in total as an apprentice to fully qualify as an emergency medical technician. Once you've established that point where you've signed off everything and you're fully qualified as an emergency medical technician, there's nothing holding you back from then going for the paramedic apprenticeship. You're good to go straight away if you wanted to. At that point, it takes a further 2 years to complete your paramedic apprenticeship, because in essence, what you're doing is you're completing the paramedic science degree, but you're just doing it from a practical perspective, a practical hands-on perspective, rather than classroom-based and more theoretical-based as you would do at university. So in total, you're looking at 3.5 years, I suppose, minimum.
Yeah, but of course, with it being an apprenticeship, you are being paid to do that as well.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. That's a really good point. That is one of the key differences. If there's people on this call that are thinking they want to be a paramedic, but they don't want to go to university, that just doesn't appeal to them, don't feel like you have to give up on your dream of becoming a paramedic. You really don't. There is this alternate route through, which is very popular, and loads of people are doing it. There's no reason why you can't too.
Okay, that's a really important, and I think it's a really good reassuring message to give to everyone as well, Ben. Let's just talk about that university route though, so the graduate route. Is there a specific degree that you need to have done to have come in as a fully qualified paramedic?
Yes. So this is something to be careful of, because there'll be lots of medical titles to degrees that you can choose between. To become a paramedic, you need to do a paramedic science degree if you're going to university. So not medicine, not nursing, it's paramedic science to become a paramedic. It's perhaps worth mentioning though that if anyone on this call was thinking they wanted to go into nursing, a really recent development that's been in place for a very, very short amount of time, and actually the East of England are currently the only trust doing, is we have nurses working on ambulances. So for those of you that are interested in nursing, I've been thinking about, well, I like the idea of working out and about on an ambulance, but I've got my heart set on becoming a nurse. That is still an option for you. It's a new thing, but it and also goes for mental health work. So if you're thinking you wanted to do a degree in mental health and becoming a mental health practitioner, again, there's a new role that's been set out where you'll be working on one of the ambulance service cars that you may have seen within some of the cities, where there's actually a mental health practitioner that mans that vehicle to help us with somebody calling 999 because they're having a mental health crisis. So the scope of roles is ever expanding. But what I would say is if you want to be a paramedic and you want to go to university, make sure you select a paramedic science degree. If, however, you want to do another role, that doesn't necessarily mean you won't end up working with us, because potentially, as these roles are expanding, there might still be scope to do that. There is for nurses. You'd be taking up a role called a pre-hospital practitioner, and there is also for mental health practitioners as well.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. Again, very, very clear answer there. And it's really great that there's such a range of different options and entry routes in. Ben, just want to ask, we've spoken about the qualifications there, and I don't want to confuse those with skills and qualities, which of course are very different things. So you work in recruitment. What are the sorts of skills and qualities that you would expect to see in a candidate, regardless of those qualifications they might have?
Yeah, that's a great question. So across the board, the kind of qualities that we look for are having things like good communication skills, having empathy, being a warm, inviting person that has a caring nature, being a resilient person, being a determined person that wants to achieve, being an ambitious person that wants to progress. So those are the kind of personal qualities that we'd want to see in an individual that applies for our service. We have 5 trust values, which really embody, I think, what we look for in a person. So the first is care. So we look for caring members of staff. The second one is quality. We want people that take pride in what they do and want to do it well. Then we've got honesty. So if you make a mistake, don't try and hide it. It will only come back and bite you. So just own up to it there and then, and you can then receive the support you need to develop from whatever that error was. We all make mistakes. So it's just acknowledging that and then building your own skill set from learning from mistakes. So honesty is another one of our trust values. Next up is teamwork. As mentioned before, it's not just the dispatchers that have to work as a team. The crews on the road, they work in pairs all the time, so they need to work as a team. The call handler relies heavily on their team leader to support them. So teamwork is an absolute must. So care, quality, teamwork, honesty, and then the last one is respect. So it's just showing respect to each other, but also to our patients. So we are going to come across every person you can imagine, going through every type of situation. So it's really important that we are an inclusive trust, and we're inclusive and we're supportive of people regardless of whatever they might be facing, whatever their background is. We would just really encourage everybody to see that individual as their own person and treat them, with respect and look after them regardless of whatever is happening to them.
Yeah. Okay. So really good and comprehensive list there of sort of skills and qualities. And I'm sure if you're watching this at the moment, you hopefully can relate some of your own attributes and experiences to those. I always like to ask the question, Ben, about what volunteering experiences someone could gain that's going to put them in good stead for when they come through application. And as that leads into my question about the role of St John Ambulance and your volunteer workforce within the ambulance service as well. So just explain the sort of the context of them and what experiences someone might gain.
Sure. So if you're under the age of 18, so if there's anyone that's sort of 16, 17, or even younger still, and they're looking for a bit of experience where you'd be gaining some of what you would gain from working on an ambulance, but rather than being in an emergency situation, perhaps you're supporting at events. St John's Ambulance would be perfect for that because they often will go to 5K, 10K races, half marathons, football matches, horse racing, you name it. If it's an event, they'll probably be booked in to go to it. Music festivals, and what a great way of experiencing all these things, knowing that you're there, you're there to support the people that are enjoying that event, should anything happen. Yeah, I think that's a really great way in. You'd be trained in first aid, and it just gives you that confidence moving forward should you want to then pick up a role when you are 18 on an ambulance.
Sure. And are there any other obvious experiences that people can gain whilst they're considering whether this is the career for them that, again, might help them in application process?
Yes, so I mean, interestingly, actually, just this morning I was talking to a gentleman who runs Army Cadets program. Again, they pick up quite similar kind of principles to what we do, so that's another thing that we could recommend. So anything that really that embodies those same values and is an outreach to people is something that you can draw on and will enable you to you know, build those skills that you would have learned from attending those types of groups, and can take forward. But yes, I think St John's Ambulance is perhaps the most obvious one, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the only one that you can do. So it's worth looking locally at what's available, and what you could do in terms of community outreach.
Yeah, great. Okay, I put that map back up there of the east of England then, but I don't need you to talk us through the geography of it again. What I wanted to get from you now is just a sort of sense of, is there a demand for people to work in the ambulance service? Is this an industry that desperately crying out for people, possibly the people watching this webinar right now?
That's a really great question, and it's very interesting how different it is from one region to another in terms of how much interest we generate. I live in Norfolk, and Norfolk is seems to be an area which is really interested in this line of work. We have a lot of applications. We have loads of people interested in almost all the roles that we have available. So we don't struggle particularly to recruit to Norfolk at all. But there are other parts of the country where it's more difficult, and we do a lot more work to reach out to the communities to try and draw people in. It may be to do with just the number of people that live in those regions, but certainly the south of Essex is an area where we do a lot of work to try and reach out to people and get them interested. But also Hertfordshire is actually one of those areas where we do have vacancies, we do have roles that we want to fill. So if this is something you want to do and you want to stay living in Hertfordshire and you want to become a paramedic or you want to become an emergency medical technician, we're looking for qualified staff in that area. So yeah, apply.
Definitely. Good. Okay, so there's and where would you physically have to go to work? This is something we discussed on Monday, pre-record. So if you live in Hertfordshire, of course, there's a big county, big gap between sort of Watford down in the southwest and Bishop Stortford. But where would you reasonably be expected to actually go to work?
Yeah. So the best way to think about this is it's divided up by where the big hospitals are, what we call acute hospitals. An acute hospital is a hospital with an A&E department. So in Hertfordshire, there are 3 hospitals with an A&E department, and we position our main ambulance station close to where that hospital is. So our main hubs, if you like, are in Watford Stevenage, and in Hemel Hempstead. And what we then do is when we recruit people to those areas, they'll be stationed either at that particular ambulance hub. So, for example, let's say they've recruited to Watford, they'll work either from Watford or any of the smaller ambulance stations that sit just outside of Watford, let's say 20 minutes drive away. And each shift they would do their shifts from Watford or Watford surrounding area. So that would be how it would work. If you live closer to Stevenage, for instance, you would be positioned closer to the Lister Hospital, and you'd work out of Stevenage ambulance station or any of the other surrounding ambulance stations that are closer to that particular hospital, the Lister Hospital, than any of the other hospitals.
And I'm guessing as well, depending on where you are in Hertfordshire, it might be that you're actually closer to Princess Alexandra Hospital in Harlow, which is part of the same trust as well. Equally, someone in Hitchin might be closer to Bedford.
Yes, that's a really good point, because the way that we, if you like, subdivide our areas, we class Hertfordshire actually as Hertfordshire and West Essex. West Essex being exactly as you said there, Harlow and surrounding area, the catchment area of the Princess Alexandra Hospital. Yes.
Good. Ben, your knowledge of Hertfordshire for someone who lives all the way up in Norfolk is outstanding. So well done. So my final question that I'm going to ask you really before we go and see if there's any more questions from the audience. So if you have got any more questions that you want to ask Ben, please do get them in now. Is what are the sorts of progression routes? So someone who's gone through that process, or maybe they started as an emergency care assistant, they become a paramedic. Where do they go on to from there? I mean, do they stay as a paramedic? I mean, obviously, as an ambulance service, you want to keep those talented people, but what are the sort of natural progression routes that someone might go outside of the ambulance service?
I think that's a really good question, and I think one of the very best things about our service, from the point of view of an employee, is that you do never get stuck. Not only do the job roles provide you so much variety because every day is different in the job you're doing, but even when you've been doing that role for a long time, you'll never reach a point where you can't learn something new and develop a new skill and move up another level if you wish to. So even when you've got to the top of those three roles that I've talked about on an ambulance, from emergency care assistant to emergency medical technician to paramedic, even when you've got to that point where you're a paramedic, it doesn't stop there. You can specialize. So you could, for instance, work on one of the helicopters as a critical care paramedic and specialize in trauma cases. You could specialize in major incidents. So we're talking things like terrorist attacks or very large scale road traffic accidents, aeroplane crashes. No, who knows what it is, but the really big incidents, and work for what's called our HART team, which is the Hazardous Area Response Team. And with that role, what you're doing is you are kitted out with all the relevant equipment and protective suits, enabling you to work in very dangerous environments, but still be able to treat patients and secure the scene. So if that sounds quite exciting, that's something you could work your way towards. Alternatively, if that all sounds a little bit scary, as a paramedic, you can go the other way. If you want to extend your skills in diagnosing patients and medicating patients and giving a wider scope of medications, so that you're a little bit more like a GP, you can go the urgent care route as well. So it's just about what interests you. If you want to develop your knowledge of medicines, or if you want to develop your understanding and skills within trauma. Even beyond that, if you simply want to just do something that's perhaps not so much patient facing, but more looking after the crews, you could go into management. You could work as a leading operations manager and manage the rest of the crews within that particular area. We also have a lot of staff that then switch across as paramedics to working in the control room. And what they then do is, for any calls that a call handler takes that doesn't need an ambulance straight away, they call them back and find out a bit more. So there's so much scope of different things that you can do.
Sure. Okay. Thank you for that answer. A couple more questions have come in. Again, final chance now. If you do want to ask Ben any more questions about anything that we've spoken about already, any clarification, please do drop it in now. So question is, Ben, do you need work experience to work in the ambulance service?
So what I would say is you need the qualifications. So you need to make sure you meet the criteria, and just make sure when you read through the person specification that the kind of things that you have done, even if it's not within a job role as such, but that you've done it somewhere. So if it's talking about, that you've got good communication skills, just think about where have you shown that? What have you done that illustrates you've got really good communication skills? It doesn't have to be through a specific work experience, but just think about what can you show on your application that shows that you meet what we're looking for.
Sure. Okay, thank you. I hope that answered that question. Again, if you've got to follow up that one, do get it in pretty quickly. Question here, what's the difference between driving an ambulance and driving one of the paramedic cars? And you know what, I'm going to extend that question, Ben, because you mentioned helicopters, which is very exciting. So I want to, first of all, answer my question about helicopter pilots. Are they trained paramedics who happen to then be trained to fly a helicopter, or are they trained helicopter pilots who then gain knowledge of being paramedics?
So if we start with the helicopter, they are paramedics that are then trained to fly helicopters. So that's the way around that it is. Yeah. With the other two roles, then sorry, not roles, the two vehicles. So an ambulance and the ambulance car, as referred to, the ambulance car is what we call a rapid response vehicle, and that is typically manned by one person, whereas the ambulance we call a double staffed ambulance because it's manned by two people. The people that would be working on the rapid response vehicle will tend to be paramedics as opposed to the technicians and emergency care assistants. There are some technicians that work on the rapid response vehicles, but generally speaking, they are paramedics, or they're the paramedics that have got those additional skills in critical care or in urgent care that we talked about earlier, or perhaps even the mental health practitioner. But normally they are the higher end of the scope of practice. The reason being is that what tends to happen is the ambulance goes to the patient, and if they assess the patient and think, oh, this could be dealt with by our urgent care paramedic rather than us taking them to hospital, they'd then let the dispatcher know, and then that urgent care paramedic on the car will go to the event and take over from the crew. So it's got its own special function. Also, that the managers will work on those rapid response vehicles, and when we have certain types of emergency that need more than two pairs of hands, generally what would happen is you would see the rapid response vehicle and the ambulance attending, as opposed to two ambulances in most cases. It's just about managing your resources and what you've got available. Obviously, with the rapid response vehicles, they're not going to have a stretcher in the back. We're not necessarily going to be able to transport the patient in that car. So when we're thinking about the transportation of the patient, that would be more for the ambulance. So that's why generally we wouldn't send two ambulances to the same job unless we've got multiple patients at scene.
Of course, yeah. Okay, makes sense. Now, another really important question we haven't covered it in there is the question is, I'll read it verbatim, what is the starting salary? But is there a starting point that everyone begins on? If they're call handlers, is it different if they're starting on the apprenticeship?
Yeah, so it is different for the different roles. So the way that the NHS pay bands work is that you have a banding from NHS band 1, NHS pay band 2, band 3, and so on. the roles that I've been talking about today, the call handler role and the emergency care assistant role, are NHS pay band 3. Now, for those two roles, pay band 3 starts just under 22,000, so that's £21,970. However, it's actually a bit better than that, because that doesn't include the fact that you're working nights and weekends. Because this is going to be unsocial hours, it's a mixture of day shifts and night shifts, you actually get additional pay for working unsocial hours. It might not sound great fun working nights and weekends, but because you're working longer days, you actually get more days off. And I must say, I actually quite miss the fact that on my old rota when I was a call handler, I used to get a week off every 5 weeks. It's not many jobs where you get that. So it's not all bad, and you do get additional pay for the fact that you're working night shifts and weekends. The dispatcher role is band 4, so that's the next pay band up, which is you're looking at probably around about £2,000 more than the bottom of the band 3, and then that also goes for the apprentice emergency medical technician. Once you're fully qualified as an emergency medical technician, in other words, you've completed your apprenticeship, you then move up to band 5. As a paramedic, when you first join us, you'll be classed as a newly qualified paramedic, and whilst you are finding your feet in that role, you'll be completing what's called a portfolio, so you're signing off with another paramedic all the various different things that you'll need to show that you can do as a paramedic. Once that's complete, you then move from band 5 as a newly qualified paramedic to band 6, which is a paramedic.
Okay, and I mean that's all incredibly transparent, and the NHS pay bands I think are quite readily available. You can probably find them as well. But I mean those are very competitive salaries actually, particularly for someone who's coming straight out of the school. So I mean I'm sure you will say, Ben, that people don't go into this industry because they want to earn loads of money. They go into it because they want to help people, they want to take care, they want to be part of really good teams that are dealing with really important situations. So you've got to balance what that salary is. That's quite a nice segue in actually, Ben. So just to finish off, there's 2 websites there that I'm showing you details of. One is the general NHS careers website, which is a fabulous website, and it highlights, I think it's over 350 different roles that the NHS needs. So that's the QR code on your left. On the right is the East of England Ambulance Service careers page on there. Ben, do you just want to explain what someone might find if they had a look on that website?
Yes, so when you have a little look on the website, what you will see is the vacancies are grouped by the specialism. So there's one area that is focusing on nursing, there's another area that is focusing on emergency services role, which is actually what you'd find all the jobs I've talked about today under. But then you've also got admin roles, so roles like mine that are more behind the scenes, in recruitment, for instance, would be under that, or any administration type roles. Then you've also got voluntary roles as well, and the mental health practitioner roles as well are in their own section. So you've got various different ways in which you can sort of navigate and have a little look through all the different vacancies.
Sure. So do familiarise yourself with both of those websites. So they're really good. They're really informative. And then, so finally, Ben, I just want to thank you for giving up your time and for sharing all your experience and knowledge, and for articulating it so wonderfully today. It's been really informative, and I'm sure very inspirational for everybody watching. So thank you for joining us, Ben.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And then thank you to all of you for watching. So particularly for those of you that are watching this session live and have submitted your own questions, which brings some real colour to the webinar as well. Thank you to those of you that are watching this subsequently as well. We really do hope that you found this really informative and really inspirational as well. And this is going to help you with your next career steps. And hopefully, Ben, you will be seeing a lot of our people watching this in the years to come when they come through the recruitment process with you. So best of luck to all of you in your future careers, and we wish you a very enjoyable evening.